At my father's black tie birthday gala, my sister slapped me across the face and shouted that I did not belong there. Everyone stared at me like I was nothing. Then Governor Michael Anderson stood up, looked around the room, and said that people really did not know who I was. Silence swallowed the entire ballroom. My sister went pale when Governor Michael Anderson revealed my true identity. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The sharp crack of an open palm striking my cheek echoed through the grand ballroom of the exclusive Atlanta Heritage Club. The crystal chandelier above us seemed to vibrate with the tension that instantly suffocated the large room. My sister Vanessa stood before me with her chest heaving as she hurled her half-empty champagne glass to the polished marble floor. The crystals shattered into tiny pieces, sending a spray of expensive sparkling wine across the hem of my custom-tailored black silk gown. She hissed at me, asking if I was wearing that cheap rag to stain the image of our family in front of hundreds of VIP guests. She loudly told me I did not belong there. I did not flinch at all. I slowly raised my hand, touching my stinging cheek, before calmly wiping a drop of spilled wine from my beautiful silk bodice. I looked her dead in the eyes and kept my voice perfectly steady. I told her that her slap hurt significantly less than the time she sneaked into my apartment and poured industrial bleach into my very first batch of natural hair products exactly 8 years ago. I said she did that because she was absolutely terrified a college dropout like me might actually succeed while she was just playing the role of a perfect high society wife. Vanessa gasped heavily and took a quick step back. She had always thought that terrible secret was completely safe. She thought I was just the weak family scapegoat who would quietly absorb her daily abuse. I reminded her how I worked 3 minimum wage jobs just to afford the raw shea butter and Jamaican black castor oil for my unique formulas. She had cruelly watched me cry over those ruined vats of product, but she never admitted her sabotage until tonight. She was completely speechless now, her perfectly manicured hands trembling wildly at her sides. Before she could formulate a lie to defend herself, our parents pushed through the thick crowd of stunned onlookers. My mother Vivian frantically smoothed down her heavily beaded designer dress, casting nervous apologies to the old money elite surrounding us. She was a woman completely obsessed with respectability politics, always desperate to present our family as flawless royalty to the outside world. My father Winston followed close behind her. His face was twisted in pure rage, but not at the daughter who had just committed physical assault in public. His fury was directed entirely at me. Vivian gripped my forearm with long, manicured nails that dug painfully into my dark skin. She demanded to know what was wrong with me and viciously accused me of intentionally trying to humiliate them. Winston did not even wait for my answer. He quickly turned to the club security guards who were hovering near the grand entrance and ordered them to call backup. He firmly declared that he would not let a dropout brat ruin the party he had spent 10 long years begging to get into. I looked at my father and felt a deep sense of pity. Winston owned a mid-sized logistics company, but his entire existence revolved around gaining the approval of the wealthy white establishment in Atlanta. He had willingly sacrificed his dignity, his morals, and his youngest daughter just to secure a simple membership card to this exclusive club. He glared at me with absolute contempt, telling me that I was a massive embarrassment to the family name. He said they had finally made it into the Heritage Club, and I showed up looking like I belonged on a dirty street corner. I simply glanced down at my dress. It was a bespoke Italian silk creation that cost more than my parents' monthly mortgage payment, but their eyes were totally blinded by their own prejudice against me. They had wrongly labeled me a complete failure the very day I left university to start my natural hair care business. To them, selling products for natural ethnic hair was not a real business at all. It was an embarrassment that did not fit their strict narrative of corporate assimilation. They desperately wanted me to conform to their narrow-minded view of success, and because I refused, they treated me like a worthless outcast. Winston raised his booming voice, making sure the wealthy patrons around us could hear his harsh denunciation. He proudly announced that I had no right to be there and that I needed to be removed immediately. The security guards hesitated, unsure of how to handle the delicate situation without causing a bigger scene in front of the governor. Winston grew much more agitated, waving his platinum membership card in the cool air. He loudly shouted that he had worked his entire life to earn his rightful place in this room, and that his wealthy son-in-law Connor had personally vouched for him to the board of directors. He said I was nothing but a parasite trying to ruin his milestone birthday. I absorbed his harsh words while preparing my mental arsenal. The direct mention of Connor, my white brother-in-law, was the perfect catalyst for what would happen next. Connor was a real estate fund manager who treated my family with thinly veiled condescension, but my parents worshipped him blindly because of his race and his perceived wealth. They gladly allowed him to disrespect our culture constantly, just to maintain their close proximity to his elevated status. I knew Connor was standing somewhere in the crowd, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of my public humiliation. He always loved seeing me put down because I was the only person who never bowed to him. The head of security finally stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on my left shoulder. He politely but firmly asked me to follow him to the back exit. My mother let out a loud breath of relief, truly thinking the crisis was averted and that their precious social standing was safely preserved. Vanessa crossed her arms and offered me a triumphant smirk, thinking she had easily won another battle in her lifelong war against me. She honestly believed I would walk away in silent shame, just like I used to do when we were younger. I did not resist the security guard. I simply stood my ground and calmly waited. I knew exactly what was about to happen next. I had planned every single detail of this evening with meticulous precision. I had spent many long years building my empire in the shadows, letting them believe I was completely destitute, while my net worth surpassed anything they could ever comprehend. Tonight was the night I was going to collect all their outstanding debts. The soft music had stopped completely. The string quartet in the corner had slowly lowered their instruments, sensing the heavy drama unfolding before their eyes. Waiters stood frozen with silver trays of expensive appetizers in their hands. The elite members of the Heritage Club leaned in closer, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. My father puffed out his chest, trying to look imposing and righteous before his peers. My mother patted her hair, her fake smile plastered on tight. They were so busy performing for the wealthy crowd that they did not notice the massive storm gathering right above their heads. They had spent 3 decades treating me like an unwanted burden, a dark smudge on their pristine canvas of respectability. They sacrificed my happiness to appease people who would never truly accept them. And now their ultimate reckoning was standing right in front of them, wrapped in black silk and armed with devastating truths. Suddenly, a booming voice echoed from the VIP table at the front of the ballroom, bringing the entire event to a complete standstill. It was Governor Michael Anderson. He pushed his chair back and stood up, his commanding presence instantly shifting the power dynamic in the large room. The security guard froze completely, dropping his hand from my shoulder in shock. My parents turned toward the governor, their faces frozen in expressions of eager deference. They foolishly expected him to agree with them, to actively support their decision to remove the trash from the premises. Governor Anderson walked slowly toward our group, looking around the elegant room with a clear mixture of disbelief and authority. He addressed the crowd of silent onlookers, asking if they really did not know who I was. The silence completely swallowed the entire ballroom. You could hear a pin drop on the marble floor. My parents exchanged very confused glances, while Vanessa lost all the color in her face. The governor stopped right beside me and placed a respectful hand on my elbow. He looked directly at my father and then at my sister. The room waited in breathless anticipation as Governor Michael Anderson said, "She is the one who just signed a $200 million grant to redevelop the entire South Atlanta district." The silence that followed was absolute. It was not just quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to drain the oxygen from the grand ballroom. Hundreds of the wealthiest and most influential people in Atlanta stood frozen like statues holding their breath. I watched my father Winston blink rapidly, his mind violently rejecting the words that had just left the governor's mouth. My mother Vivian stood completely rigid, her manicured hands gripping her designer evening bag so tightly her knuckles turned a sickly shade of white. Beside them, my sister Vanessa looked as though the floor had vanished beneath her expensive heels. The arrogant smirk she wore just seconds ago melted into an expression of sheer terror. Governor Anderson did not break eye contact with my father. He stood tall and commanding, radiating the kind of established power my parents had spent their entire lives begging for. He repeated the statement, letting the massive figure hang in the air. $200 million. He explained that my real estate fund had secured the largest urban renewal initiative in the state's history. He pointed out that while my father was busy shouting for security to throw me out, I was the sole reason this very venue and the surrounding historical blocks were protected from corporate demolition. My mother let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh, trying to shatter the unbearable tension. She stepped forward and forced a polite smile, telling the governor there must be some kind of administrative mix-up. She actually waved her hand dismissively in my direction and told the most powerful man in the state that I was just a college dropout who mixed up cheap hair lotion in a dirty kitchen. She insisted I was incapable of managing anything beyond a minimum wage paycheck. Her desperate need to drag me down to protect her own fragile ego was on full display for everyone to witness. Before the governor could correct her delusion, my brother-in-law pushed his way to the front of the crowd. Connor stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that cost more than my first car. He was a wealthy white real estate fund manager who had always viewed my family with a sickening blend of amusement and disdain. My parents worshipped him. They treated him like a golden ticket to elite society, constantly sacrificing their own dignity and heritage to make him feel comfortable in his racial and economic privilege. Connor casually wrapped his arm around Vanessa's waist and let out a loud, condescending chuckle. He looked at the governor with the brazen confidence of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. He shook his head and smirked, flashing his perfect teeth. He smoothly interrupted the governor and said, "We all needed to be realistic here." He claimed that I had probably just bagged some government diversity grant. He actually used his fingers to make air quotes around the word diversity. He looked me up and down with utter contempt and told the crowd that the city was probably just throwing a few pity dollars at my little hair grease business to appease my community. The racial microaggressions were not even hidden. They were woven into his every word, designed to remind everyone in the room that he viewed me as a charity case who only advanced because of government handouts. He completely diminished my massive financial achievement, reducing a 9-figure urban redevelopment fund to a petty handout. He then puffed out his chest and decided to re-establish the social hierarchy. He loudly proclaimed that playing with charity money was cute, but real business required actual capital and sharp instincts. He proudly announced that real business was his brand new $50 million luxury condo project right in the heart of Midtown. He boasted that his firm was transforming the city skyline while I was just selling shampoo to people who could barely afford it. I did not react to his blatant racism. I did not raise my voice or defend my products. I just watched the disgusting dynamic unfold exactly as I knew it would. My father Winston immediately nodded in eager agreement with Connor. Instead of defending his own black daughter against a man who was openly insulting her intelligence and her community, my father sided with the white son-in-law. Winston eagerly patted Connor's shoulder and loudly agreed, saying that Connor was a true visionary. Winston told the crowd that Connor represented the future of our family legacy and that his Midtown project was a masterclass in high-level investing. My father was actively throwing his own flesh and blood under the bus, just to bask in the reflected glory of Connor's white privilege. The elite guests began to murmur among themselves. Some looked uncomfortable with Connor's harsh wording, but many others seemed to accept his explanation. In their prejudiced minds, it made much more sense that a young black woman like me was relying on government diversity handouts rather than leading a massive private equity firm. Connor smiled smugly, feeling completely victorious. He honestly believed he had just put me back in my place and restored the natural order of things. I let him enjoy his false sense of superiority for exactly 3 seconds. I did not get mad. I did not shout or demand an apology. Emotional outbursts were exactly what they expected from me. Instead, I remained perfectly calm. I slowly unclasped my black designer purse. The soft click of the metal lock seemed to echo in the quiet space. I reached inside and smoothly pulled out my sleek tablet. I tapped the screen and the bright light illuminated my face in the dim ballroom. I kept my eyes fixed on the screen as I casually scrolled through a digital document. My voice was completely relaxed and conversational, devoid of any anger or panic. I looked up and met Connor's arrogant gaze. I asked him if he was talking about the $50 million luxury condo project located in Midtown. His smug smile faltered just a fraction, but he nodded proudly, confirming that was exactly the one. I let a cold, calculated smile touch my lips. I looked straight into his eyes and told him what a massive coincidence that was, because I was just reviewing its financials this morning. I slowly turned the sleek silver screen of my tablet toward him, making sure the bright display was perfectly visible, not just to Connor, but to my parents and the wealthy guests crowding around us. I watched the arrogant smirk melt off his face, replaced by a sudden tense confusion. He leaned in closer, his eyes darting across the digital spreadsheet and the bold red warning labels highlighting his massive deficits. I kept my voice smooth and conversational as I walked him through his own impending ruin. I told him that his so-called luxury condo project was currently suspended. I watched his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard, trying to process the confidential documents I was holding in my hand. I explained loudly enough for the entire room to hear that his firm was exactly 90 days late on a $15 million debt payment. Connor tried to snatch the tablet from my hand, but I smoothly pulled it back out of his reach. He stammered, asking how I could possibly have access to his private corporate financial records. He nervously looked around at the elite guests who were now whispering and pointing at him. The powerful fund manager who had just been bragging about transforming the city skyline was suddenly sweating through his expensive custom tuxedo. I smiled pleasantly and asked him if he remembered the name of the private equity firm that held the primary lien on his development. He grit his teeth and muttered the name, Apex Investment Fund. I nodded slowly, confirming his answer. Then I asked him if he wanted to guess who the founder and majority shareholder of Apex Investment Fund was. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. All the color drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the crystal chandeliers. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The woman he had just publicly humiliated, the woman he had dismissed as a charity case selling hair grease, was the very person holding the financial noose around his neck. I was not just a successful entrepreneur, I was his primary creditor. I owned his debt, and by extension, I owned his entire future. Vanessa shrieked, breaking the heavy silence. She stepped in front of her husband, pointing a trembling manicured finger at my face. She accused me of fabricating the documents. She desperately told the surrounding crowd that I was a bitter, jealous dropout who was just trying to ruin her husband's stellar reputation with fake spreadsheets. She clung to Connor's arm, begging him to tell everyone that I was lying. But Connor could not speak. He just stared at the tablet in my hand, his breathing growing shallow and rapid. He knew the numbers were real. He knew his company was bleeding cash, and he knew he had been hiding the impending default from his investors, his wife, and my parents. My mother, Vivian, could not handle the public embarrassment. The carefully constructed facade of her perfect high society family was crumbling right in front of the governor and the most influential people in Atlanta. She lunged forward, inserting herself between me and Connor. Her face was flushed with panic and anger. She completely dropped her refined, polite socialite persona and reverted to the harsh, controlling mother I remembered from my childhood. Vivian grabbed my wrist tightly, her voice a frantic hissed whisper that still managed to echo in the quiet ballroom. She commanded me to cancel that debt right now. She ordered me to call my lawyers and erase the $15 million balance immediately. She spoke to me not as a successful businesswoman, but as an obedient child who was expected to sacrifice everything for the sake of family harmony. I gently but firmly removed her hand from my wrist. I asked her why on earth I would forgive a massive commercial debt for a man who had just insulted my intelligence and my community. That was when Vivian played what she thought was her ultimate trump card. She threw away all logic and decency, relying purely on maternal authority and her twisted sense of family loyalty. She raised her chin and looked down her nose at me. She asked me if I knew where Connor got the initial seed money to start his real estate firm all those years ago. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I had always suspected the truth, but hearing her bring it up now in front of hundreds of people was entirely different. I stayed completely silent, allowing her to dig her own grave. Vivian proudly announced that the seed money came from my college fund. The entire ballroom let out a collective gasp. The whispers among the wealthy elite instantly turned into loud murmurs of absolute disgust. Even the governor took a step back, shaking his head in disbelief. My mother did not seem to care about the crowd's reaction. She was entirely focused on putting me back in my place. She aggressively justified her actions, stating that she and my father had emptied my college savings account and handed every single penny over to Connor. She looked at her white son-in-law with a sickening expression of adoration before turning her harsh glare back to me. She proudly declared that they gave him my money because he was the only one fit to bring prestige to our family name. She said I was wasting my time mixing useless natural hair treatments in the kitchen while Connor was building real wealth and status. She loudly insisted that because my money had helped him start his company, I owed it to the family to forgive his current massive debt. In her deeply prejudiced mind, sacrificing my education and my future to fund her white son-in-law's ambition was not a betrayal. It was a necessary investment in respectability. I stood completely still, absorbing the full weight of her confession. For years they had told me there was no money left for my tuition. They had watched me work multiple grueling minimum wage jobs. They had watched me exhaust myself bagging groceries and scrubbing floors just to buy raw materials for my business. They called me a failure and a dropout, all while knowing they had intentionally stolen my future to hand it to a man who openly despised our culture. Vanessa looked incredibly smug, nodding along with my mother. She truly believed that this revelation would shame me into submission. She thought the knowledge that my parents had chosen her husband over me would completely break my spirit and force me to comply with their demands. Connor seemed to recover a fraction of his arrogance, straightening his tuxedo jacket and waiting for me to yield to my mother's command. The heavy silence stretched on as everyone in the ballroom waited for my reaction. They expected tears. They expected me to run away in shame, just like the old Tara would have done. Instead, I began to laugh. It started as a soft chuckle and quickly grew into a loud, chilling laugh that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the ballroom. The sound was completely devoid of warmth or joy. It was a cold, calculating sound that made my mother step back in sudden fear. My laughter sliced through the tension, leaving my family looking incredibly foolish and deeply unsettled. I slowly stopped laughing and looked at my mother with eyes completely empty of daughterly affection. I asked her if she honestly thought I came here tonight to ask for that pathetic pocket change back. I leaned in slightly, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch that promised absolute destruction. I told her I did not come for my college fund. I came for something much bigger. The sound of my laughter hung in the heavy air of the ballroom, making the crystal chandeliers seem to rattle above us. My father Winston turned a deep shade of crimson. The veins in his neck bulged against the stiff collar of his tuxedo shirt. He could not fathom that the daughter he had spent 30 years burying under his immense expectations was now looking down at him with such cold authority. He had spent his entire life playing by the rules of a society that did not even want him. He had polished his accent and perfectly tailored his suits and sacrificed his own blood to buy his way into this elite space. To him, my confidence was not just disrespectful, it was a direct threat to his very survival in this room. He stepped forward aggressively, his dress shoes clicking sharply against the marble floor. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket and pulled out a sleek black leather wallet. His hands were shaking with pure rage as he slid out a heavy metal platinum membership card. He held it up high for everyone in the ballroom to see, especially the wealthy white patrons who were watching our family fall apart. He demanded that the club manager come forward immediately. He raised his voice so it echoed off the gilded walls, stating that he was a platinum member of the Heritage Club, and that he demanded I be escorted off the premises right now. He told the crowd that I was a disturbed individual who had no business breathing the same air as polite society. He looked at me with a gaze so full of hatred it could have frozen water and told me that my little performance was over. He said I was nothing but a ghetto embarrassment, and he would not allow me to poison the greatest night of his life. The head manager of the club, a distinguished older man in a pristine tailcoat, quickly made his way through the parted sea of guests. His name was Mr. Sterling, and he had run the daily operations of this establishment for over 2 decades, handling the elite families of the city with extreme discretion. My father puffed out his chest as Mr. Sterling approached, expecting the manager to immediately summon the burly security guards and physically drag me out into the cold street. Winston pointed his platinum card directly at my face and told Mr. Sterling to remove this woman from his sight because she was harassing his distinguished guests and ruining a private birthday celebration. My father waited for the satisfying validation of his elite status. He waited for the white establishment to side with him against the loud and disruptive black woman who refused to stay in her proper place. But Mr. Sterling did not look at my father. He did not even acknowledge the platinum card shining under the bright lights of the ballroom. Instead, Mr. Sterling stopped 2 feet away from me and offered a deep and respectful bow. He kept his head lowered for a brief moment before standing up straight and asking me in a soft professional tone if everything was all right and if I needed him to clear the room for my privacy. My father. Winston's mouth fell completely open. His arm slowly dropped to his side, the heavy metal card feeling utterly useless in his suddenly weak grasp. The entire ballroom shifted uncomfortably as they witnessed the head manager of the most exclusive club in Atlanta bowing deeply to the woman they had all just assumed was a charity case. Vivian. My mother let out a small, breathless gasp, her hands flying to her pearl necklace as she tried to process the impossible scene unfolding before her eyes. Connor was still trembling next to her, completely paralyzed by the financial ruin I had just laid out before him on my tablet. The wealthy elite guests, who had been sipping their expensive champagne and enjoying the dramatic spectacle, suddenly realized that the power dynamic in the room had drastically shifted. They began to whisper among themselves, trying to figure out how the young woman in the black silk dress commanded such absolute respect from the senior staff of a notoriously strict institution. I smiled warmly at Mr. Sterling and told him that clearing the room would not be necessary just yet. I thanked him for his excellent service and told him he could return to his normal duties. He nodded respectfully and stepped back, blending into the shadows of the room like a well-trained ghost. I then turned my attention back to my father, whose face had transitioned from furious crimson to a sickly pale gray. His eyes darted around the room, searching for a logical explanation that his prejudiced mind could actually accept. He stammered out a loud demand, wanting to know why the manager was treating me with such extreme reverence. He insisted that he was the platinum member and that it was his son-in-law Connor who had pulled the powerful strings to get his application approved. He was practically begging the universe to validate his core belief that proximity to whiteness was the only true path to power and respect in this world. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out a thick legal folder. I held the smooth, leather-bound document in my hands, letting the physical weight of it ground me in the present moment. I looked deeply into my father's eyes and asked him why he truly thought the board of directors had finally approved his membership application last month after a solid decade of continuous humiliating rejections. I reminded him of all the years he had spent sending expensive gifts to board members, hosting lavish dinners he could barely afford, and changing his entire personality just to fit into their rigid mold. I asked him if he honestly believed that Connor's failing real estate firm had enough social capital to secure a platinum tier membership at a club built entirely on old money and systemic exclusion. I watched as the painful truth began to slowly chip away at his decades of carefully constructed delusions. I opened the folder and pulled out a crisp stack of acquisition papers. I told my father that his membership approval had absolutely nothing to do with Connor or his supposed social influence. I explained that for the past 2 years, I had been quietly acquiring massive amounts of commercial real estate across Atlanta through my investment fund. I told him that I had specifically targeted the holding company that owned the prime land and the historic building where the Heritage Club currently operated. I detailed how this very building was constructed on land that originally belonged to prominent African American business owners before it was violently stripped away by discriminatory zoning laws many decades ago. I told him my core mission was to reclaim that history and restore financial ownership to our community. I spoke clearly, ensuring that every single word carried the immense weight of my financial and historical victory over the establishment he so desperately worshipped. I let my words sink into the heavy silence of the ballroom. I told my father that exactly 3 weeks ago, my firm successfully purchased 80% of the club's real estate holding company. I told him that I was now the absolute majority owner of the very ground beneath his expensive leather shoes. I explained that when his desperate membership application crossed the board of directors' table for the 11th time, they were actively preparing to reject him once again. They only approved it because the new majority owner of their building specifically instructed them to do so, under threat of lease termination. I looked at his horrified expression and told him that I personally pushed his paperwork through the committee. I told him I gave him the platinum card he was clutching so tightly, just so I could stand in this exact spot on his birthday and watch him try to use it as a weapon against me. The sheer devastation on my father's face was a flawless masterpiece of poetic justice. His knees seemed to buckle slightly under the crushing weight of the truth. His entire life philosophy, his desperate worship of the white elite, his toxic respectability politics, his absolute certainty that I was a worthless failure, all of it was instantly obliterated in front of a live audience. He realized in a span of a few agonizing seconds that the ultimate status symbol he had sacrificed his own daughter to achieve was actually just a cynical gift from the very daughter he had discarded. He was standing in the center of the most exclusive room in the city, and he suddenly understood that he only belonged there because I generously allowed it. I told him plainly and clearly that he was standing in my house. The whispers in the crowd grew significantly louder. The wealthy patrons were no longer looking at my family with respect or admiration. They were looking at them with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. The grand illusion of the wealthy, flawless family had been violently shattered beyond any hope of repair. My mother, Vivian, was hyperventilating, her chest heaving heavily as she clung to my father's arm for sheer physical support. Her absolute worst nightmare was coming true right in front of her judgmental country club friends. Everyone now knew that their prestige was entirely manufactured. They were totally exposed as pathetic social climbers who were willing to destroy their own flesh and blood for a tiny taste of high society validation. My sister Vanessa could no longer handle the crushing reality of my power and influence. She had spent her entire 34 years defining her own personal worth by my supposed failures and shortcomings. If I was a billionaire real estate mogul and the literal owner of the very club they worshipped, then Vanessa was absolutely nothing. Her entire identity as the golden child, the perfect high society wife, was evaporating into thin air right before her eyes. The immense psychological stress of the situation pushed her completely over the edge of reason. The polite manners she had spent her whole life perfecting suddenly vanished, leaving behind only raw, unhinged jealousy and bitter panic. Vanessa suddenly lunged forward, her face contorted in a terrifying mask of pure desperation and rage. Her perfectly styled hair was coming undone, and her expensive makeup was streaked with sweat. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking wildly as it echoed across the large, silent ballroom. She yelled that it did not matter how much money I had hidden away or what historic buildings I had purchased in secret. She frantically waved her arms and declared that my wealth was completely illegitimate and stolen. She looked around at the distinguished guests, practically begging them not to believe my undeniable success. The crowd watched in stunned fascination as Vanessa lost all her composure and grace. She screamed that I was still just a common thief who got lucky in the market. She frantically told the silent audience that they should not be impressed by my natural hair care empire or my massive real estate funds. She yelled that the core chemical formula for the hair products that built my entire fortune was legally registered under our family trust. She stated with manic, absolute certainty that our father had cleverly secured the rights to my early work years ago when I was still living under their roof. She screamed out with a wild, desperate triumph, claiming that they were the true legal owners of my entire empire and that every single dime I had ever made belonged exclusively to them. Vanessa pointed her trembling finger directly at my chest. She was breathing heavily, her eyes wide with a frantic, manic energy that bordered on madness. She insisted that I could not come into their special event and act like a god, when everything I possessed was legally tied to the family name. She yelled that they would take me to court and strip me of every single asset, every commercial building, and every bank account, until I was back on the streets where I truly belonged. She truly believed she had just delivered the final killing blow that would put me back in my designated place as the family loser. She thought the legal paperwork from years ago was an unbreakable chain that would forever bind my monumental success to their greedy hands. The room waited in absolute silence, waiting to see if my sister's desperate legal threat held any actual weight, hoping to see how the billionaire outcast would respond to the claim that she owned absolutely nothing. Vanessa reached into her sequined designer clutch, with hands that were trembling uncontrollably, and yanked out a folded piece of thick parchment paper. She smoothed it out against her chest, her eyes wide with a crazed, frantic victory that made her look completely unhinged. She shoved the paper into the empty air between us, shaking it violently, as if the mere physical presence of the document could somehow shield her from the disaster I was unleashing. She screamed that it was the official patent registry and that she had the ultimate proof right there in her hands. She proudly announced to the dead silent ballroom that our father had registered the exact chemical breakdown of my natural hair care line 5 long years ago. She said he did it the very week I moved out of their house and started my business from nothing. She gloated loudly, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers that they owned every single proprietary blend I had ever created and that every dime I was making legally belonged to their family trust. She smugly declared that they were the true masters of my empire and that I was nothing more than an unpaid employee working for their benefit. Winston suddenly stood a little taller, his chest puffing out with renewed arrogant pride. He looked at the club manager and the wealthy guests around us, as if this crumpled document completely validated his cruel behavior and restored his elite status. Vivian let out a long breath of relief, her hands smoothing down her expensive beaded dress as she smiled a terrible predatory smile. They honestly thought they had me cornered. They actually believed my entire billion-dollar empire was built on a foundation they legally controlled. Connor even managed a weak smirk, thinking his golden goose family had just miraculously saved him from the massive debt I held over his head. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and stood next to his wife, preparing to watch me beg for mercy. I looked at the official patent document shaking in my sister's manicured hand. I looked at the triumphant sneer on her face and the greedy anticipation burning in my parents' eyes. I did not feel fear. I did not feel panic. I did not even feel a single ounce of worry. I simply threw my head back and let out a loud, genuine laugh. My laughter cut through the heavy, suffocating tension in the grand ballroom like a sharp, physical blade. It was not a nervous laugh or a defensive chuckle. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated amusement at their sheer, unbelievable stupidity. The wealthy guests exchanged confused glances, stepping even further away from my family, as if their foolishness might be contagious. The governor watched me with intense fascination, clearly realizing that I was 10 steps ahead of the people who thought they had outsmarted me. Vanessa demanded to know what was so funny, her voice cracking with sudden uncertainty as my laughter continued to fill the room. I slowly stopped laughing and looked her dead in the eyes, letting the cold reality of my words sink into her bones. I told her she really was the most stupid person I had ever had the misfortune of knowing. I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, forcing her to stumble backward in her high heels. I asked her if she honestly thought I would build a multi-billion-dollar global empire on a formula that she had deliberately poisoned. I watched the blood drain completely from her face, leaving her looking like a pale ghost under the bright lights. I reminded her of that terrible night 8 years ago when she thought she was so clever. The night she sneaked into my small apartment while I was working my third job and poured industrial bleach into my very first batch of raw, natural materials. I kept my voice loud and clear, ensuring the governor and every single elite patron in the room heard the full extent of their treachery. I explained that I knew she had poisoned that batch the second I walked into my apartment and smelled the harsh, toxic chemicals. I told her I had immediately discarded that ruined formula and spent the next 3 years developing an entirely new organic compound that was 1,000 times more effective and completely safe. But I knew my family was greedy. I knew my father was always looking for a way to steal my hard work. So I left the old notebook containing the original discarded recipe right there on my desk as perfect bait. I told the crowd how my father was so blinded by his greed and his desperate need to control my potential success that he broke into my old room and stole that useless notebook. He had rushed to patent the exact formula that his precious golden child had secretly laced with toxic industrial bleach. Winston staggered backward, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as his mind struggled to process the magnitude of his error. He realized he had spent thousands of dollars to legally patent pure poison. But I was not finished tightening the trap. I turned my attention back to Connor, who was sweating profusely again, his eyes darting toward the exit doors. I told the silent crowd that my father and my sister wanted their stolen patent to look legitimate and heavily backed by real corporate money. They did not want to associate the formula with their own small logistics company. So they convinced their perfect white son-in-law to register that toxic chemical nightmare directly under his luxury real estate and investment firm. They used his corporate umbrella to shield their stolen goods. I smiled at Connor and asked him if he knew what happened when a major investment firm officially registered a hazardous industrial chemical compound under the guise of a safe consumer cosmetic product. Connor opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His eyes were wide with pure, absolute terror as he finally realized the catastrophic legal danger he was in. I told him the answer was very simple and incredibly severe. I explained that the Federal Food and Drug Administration conducts mandatory chemical audits on all registered proprietary blends attached to large corporate entities. I took another step closer to him, dropping my voice to a lethal calm tone that carried clearly across the marble floor. I informed him that the federal inspectors had recently pulled the file on his registered formula for a routine safety check. They tested the theoretical compound and immediately discovered the toxic levels of industrial bleach and completely unauthorized hazardous materials. I told him that as of this very morning, the Federal Food and Drug Administration, alongside federal prosecutors, had officially launched a massive criminal investigation into his entire corporate network. They were investigating him for intent to distribute hazardous materials, corporate fraud, and reckless endangerment. The absolute horror that washed over Connor's face was a beautiful thing to witness. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to grab the edge of a nearby cocktail table just to stay upright. He looked at my parents with a level of hatred that could have burned down the entire Heritage Club. He realized his in-laws had not just embarrassed him socially, but had legally tied his entire professional existence to a massive federal crime. They had used his pristine corporate registry to patent a toxic weapon, and now he was going to take the fall for their blinding incompetence. Vivian tried to reach out to him, but he violently slapped her hand away. His breathing ragged and shallow as a full-blown panic attack began to take hold of his body. Suddenly, the sharp, shrill sound of a cell phone ringing shattered the quiet stillness of the ballroom. It was coming from Connor's tuxedo pocket. He fumbled blindly for it, his hands shaking so violently, he nearly dropped the expensive device onto the floor. As he stared down at the bright screen, another phone in his inner pocket began to ring with a different urgent tone. Then his smartwatch started buzzing incessantly against his wrist, lighting up with continuous rapid notifications. The news was breaking. The federal investigation had just hit the financial wires and the major news networks. I watched with deep, peaceful satisfaction as Connor answered the first call, his voice a high-pitched, desperate whimper as he tried to speak to whoever was on the other end of the line. I told him he should probably take all of those calls because it was likely his few remaining wealthy investors pulling out en masse to escape the massive federal scandal he was now the center of. I told him his firm was dead, his $50 million condo project was dead, and his freedom was hanging by a very thin thread. Connor dropped his phone, letting it clatter loudly onto the marble floor. He grabbed his own hair, pulling at the perfect blonde strands as he let out a raw, guttural scream. His mind completely broke right there in the middle of the gala, crushed entirely under the unbearable weight of his total and permanent destruction. The heavy marble floor of the Heritage Club seemed to absorb the sounds of Connor's gasping breaths as he knelt amidst his scattered devices. His face, which had always been a mask of perfectly manicured white privilege, was now twisted into something ugly and primal. He slowly raised his head and looked at my sister Vanessa. The loving, affectionate gaze of the perfect high society husband was completely gone. In its place was a look of pure, unadulterated venom. He slowly pushed himself up from the floor, ignoring the continuous buzzing of his phone. He pointed a shaking finger at Vanessa, and then at my mother Vivian. The polite corporate charm he had used to manipulate my family for years instantly evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the raw, ugly racism that had always lurked just beneath his expensive surface. Connor suddenly snapped his voice, tearing through the quiet ballroom like a jagged blade. He screamed at Vanessa, telling her that this was all her fault. He did not hold back a single drop of his hatred. He yelled that her entire family was nothing but ignorant ghetto trash and that they had ruined his perfect life. He paced back and forth, his face turning a blotchy red as he unleashed a horrifying racist tirade right in the middle of the elegant gala. He called them cheap coat riders who were absolutely desperate to cling to his coattails just to feel like they belonged in a world that would never truly accept them. He laughed bitterly, telling Vanessa that she was a fool to ever think he actually respected her or her family. He loudly confessed that he always found them completely disgusting and that he only tolerated their pathetic attempts at high society elegance because they were so desperate to give him their money. He looked directly at my mother, Vivian, and mocked her heavily beaded dress and her fake refined accent. He told her that all her country club friends laughed at her behind her back, and that all the money in the world could never wash away the fact that she was just a desperate social climber. He yelled that they had practically begged him to take my college fund because they were so blinded by their need for white validation. He said he gladly took their money because it was the only thing they were good for. He completely stripped away every single ounce of dignity my family had tried to build over the past 3 decades. The wealthy elite guests, who my parents had spent years trying to impress, simply stood and watched the spectacle with expressions of detached horror and morbid fascination. Nobody stepped forward to help my mother as she began to openly weep under the crushing weight of Connor's vile insults. despite hearing the man he treated like a son openly degrade and humiliate our family. My father, Winston, refused to break from his lifelong devotion to respectability politics. Even in the face of blatant, vicious racism, Winston was still entirely focused on saving face in front of the white establishment. He could not bear the thought of the Heritage Club members seeing his family as anything less than perfect. Instead of defending his wife and his daughter, Winston stepped toward Connor with his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of appeasement. He forced a nervous, trembling smile onto his face and begged Connor to lower his voice. He spoke in a soft, placating tone, pleading with his son-in-law to calm down and promising that they could fix this whole misunderstanding quietly. Winston actually apologized to the man who was currently screaming racial slurs at his family. He told Connor that they would hire the best lawyers and leverage all their assets to make the federal investigation go away. Winston reached out his hands, trying to pat Connor's shoulder in a desperate bid to restore order and maintain the illusion of their dignified family bond. He told Connor that they were all in this together and that they just needed to smile and walk away before they caused any more of a scene. The sheer pathetic nature of my father's desperation was nauseating to witness. He was willing to swallow every racist insult and every public degradation just to keep his proximity to Connor's perceived power. He wanted to protect the white man who was currently destroying his family simply because that man represented the social status Winston craved more than his own self-respect. But Connor was too far gone to care about my father's respectability politics. As Winston reached out to touch his shoulder, Connor let out a roar of absolute disgust. He violently shoved my father right in the center of his chest. The force of the push caught Winston completely off guard. My father stumbled backward, his arms flailing wildly as his expensive leather shoes slipped on the polished marble floor. He crashed down hard onto the ground, his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket riding up and his glasses flying off his face to skitter across the floor. Vivian let out a piercing shriek and rushed to his side, but Connor just stood over him and laughed. It was a cruel, mocking laugh that echoed terribly in the large room. Connor looked down at my father sprawled on the floor and sneered. He told Winston that he was a pathetic old fool who had sold his soul for a membership card to a club that secretly despised him. He mocked my father's desperate attempts to fit into elite society, laughing at how Winston would always agree with every single conservative talking point, just to make the white members feel comfortable. Connor yelled that Winston was nothing more than a convenient joke to everyone in the room, and that watching him try to act like old money was the most pathetic comedy show in Atlanta. He kicked my father's platinum membership card across the floor, telling him that a piece of plastic would never change the fact that he was just a desperate beggar in a cheap suit. Vanessa dropped to her knees beside our father, sobbing uncontrollably as her entire worldview shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She had spent her life trying to destroy me, just to earn the approval of a man who viewed her as nothing more than an ignorant pawn. She cried out to Connor, asking him how he could say such horrible things after all the years they spent together. She pleaded with him to take it back, to tell everyone he was just stressed and did not mean a single word of his racist tirade. But Connor just sneered at her, telling her to shut her mouth and stop embarrassing herself. He told her she was lucky he even gave her the time of day, and that without his last name, she was absolutely nothing. He stood in the center of the ballroom, breathing heavily, his face red and sweating, completely unaware of his surroundings as he reveled in the destruction of my family. I stood a few feet away, watching the entire horrific scene unfold with complete and utter calm. I did not feel a single drop of sympathy for my parents or my sister. They had actively chosen this path. They had chosen to worship a man who hated them simply because of his race and his perceived status, while simultaneously discarding their own daughter because she chose to embrace her authentic self. They had traded their dignity for an illusion, and now the bill had finally come due. They were on the floor crying and broken, while the man they had elevated above me tore them to shreds in front of the entire city elite. It was the most complete and devastating poetic justice I could have ever engineered. The silence in the room was absolute save for the sound of my mother's quiet sobbing and my father's heavy breathing as he lay on the floor. The string quartet in the corner had completely packed away their instruments. The waitstaff had retreated to the edges of the room, their silver trays hanging forgotten at their sides. The elite members of the Heritage Club simply stared at the spectacle before them, completely paralyzed by the sheer vulgarity of the situation. They had come for a refined evening of networking and polite conversation, and instead they were witnessing the total implosion of a family that had tried so desperately to infiltrate their ranks. Connor puffed out his chest, looking around the room as if expecting the wealthy guests to applaud him for putting his ghetto in-laws back in their proper place. He truly believed that because of his background and his connections, the elite crowd would naturally side with him despite the vile things he had just screamed at the top of his lungs. He adjusted his ruined tuxedo jacket and took a deep breath, ready to turn his attention back to me and attempt to salvage his shattered pride. He thought he still had a chance to walk out of this room with some shred of his dignity intact. But before Connor could even open his mouth to speak, a sudden loud rhythmic tapping sound echoed loudly through the grand ballroom. Tap, tap, tap. The sharp electronic noise immediately cut through the heavy atmosphere, bringing every single murmur and sob to a dead halt. Everyone in the room instinctively turned their heads toward the source of the sound. Governor Michael Anderson was standing perfectly still behind the main presentation podium at the front of the stage. He was looking down at Connor with an expression of such profound, absolute disgust that it made the room temperature seem to drop 10 degrees. The governor slowly raised his hand and tapped his index finger against the large presentation microphone one more time. Tap! The sound boomed from the massive speakers mounted all around the walls and ceiling of the Heritage Club. The governor kept his eyes locked on Connor as he slowly leaned into the microphone. His voice was deadly calm and amplified to a deafening volume. He asked Connor if he realized that the podium microphone was tied directly into the statewide press feed. He informed the silent, terrified room that the audio feed had been completely live this entire time. He stated clearly that every single vile racist word of Connor's unhinged tirade had just been broadcast directly to the dozens of press fans and local news reporters waiting right outside the club doors. The governor shook his head slowly and told Connor that his career was not just ruined by a federal investigation, but his entire life was now officially and permanently canceled. The silence that followed the governor's announcement was absolute and terrifying. Every single pair of eyes in the grand ballroom was locked on Connor. The realization that his vile, racist tirade had just been broadcast live to every local news station in the state washed over the crowd like a freezing wave. People who had been trying to network with him just 20 minutes ago were now physically backing away from him, as if he were carrying a deadly plague. Through the large glass doors at the front of the Heritage Club, we could already see the chaotic flashes of press cameras lighting up the dark street outside. Reporters were scrambling and shouting, completely electrified by the massive scandal that had just fallen right into their laps. Connor's perfect elite life had vanished in the span of 30 seconds. He was no longer the golden boy of Atlanta real estate. He was a disgraced federal suspect who had just committed career suicide on a live microphone. Connor stood frozen for a long moment, his chest heaving as the weight of his absolute destruction finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his sanity. He looked at the governor, and then he looked at the horrified faces of the wealthy patrons who were actively whispering about his downfall. His face twisted into a grotesque mask of sheer desperate rage. A cornered animal, realizing there was absolutely no way out of the trap, he snapped completely. His eyes darted to my father Winston, who was still sitting on the cold marble floor, looking like a hollowed-out shell of a man. Connor bared his teeth in a vicious snarl, deciding that if he was going down, he was going to drag my entire family down into the dirt with him. He let out a harsh, hysterical laugh that echoed terribly across the elegant room. He screamed at the top of his lungs that he did not care about the microphone, or the press, or the club. He pointed a shaking finger at my father and yelled that Winston was the one who was truly finished. Connor frantically announced to the entire room that Winston's mid-sized logistics company had legally guaranteed his $50 million luxury condo loans. The words hit the air like a physical explosive. Connor looked at me with wild, bloodshot eyes and screamed that if I foreclosed on his firm, my own father would go completely bankrupt. He laughed maniacally, declaring that our destinies were legally bound together and that my revenge would effectively destroy my own bloodline. The collective gasp from the elite audience was deafening. My father, Winston, looked as though he had just been shot in the chest. His eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror as he stared up at the white son-in-law he had worshipped for years. The logistics company was Winston's entire life. He had spent 30 grueling years building that business from a single broken-down delivery truck into a respectable regional operation. It was his only source of true pride and the sole foundation of his wealth. He had sacrificed his time, his health, and his relationship with me just to keep that company afloat. And now the man he had trusted more than his own daughter was gleefully using it as a human shield. Winston scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking violently as he reached out toward Connor. He stammered in a weak, pathetic voice, asking Connor what he was talking about. Winston frantically explained to the room that the paperwork he signed was just a simple character reference, a standard character voucher for the bank. He had blindly trusted Connor because Connor was a wealthy white man who promised him endless access to elite society. Winston had been so desperate for approval that he never even bothered to hire an independent lawyer to review the massive stack of complex financial documents Connor had placed in front of him. He just signed on the dotted line, eagerly handing over the keys to his entire empire for a polite pat on the back. I stood perfectly still, watching my father crumble under the catastrophic weight of his own blinding prejudice. I did not feel a single drop of pity for the man who had cast me aside when I needed him most. I looked at my father with eyes as cold and hard as solid ice. My voice was incredibly calm, but it carried a razor-sharp edge that sliced straight through his pathetic denial. I asked him if he really cross-collateralized his entire 30-year-old logistics company to secure a high-risk real estate loan for his son-in-law without even bothering to read the fine print. My father opened his mouth to deny it, but no sound came out. The devastating truth was already written all over his terrified face. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, ensuring that every elite guest in the room could hear the harsh reality of his monumental failure. I explained to him that Connor did not just ask for a character reference. I told Winston that Connor had legally structured the debt so that the logistics company served as the primary collateral for the massive $50 million Midtown project. I watched my father's knees begin to tremble as the financial trap closed tightly around him. I kept my eyes locked on his pale, sweating face and delivered the final, crushing blow. I told him that Connor had just officially defaulted on his massive debt to the Apex Investment Fund. I explained that the sudden, devastating launch of the Federal Food and Drug Administration criminal probe into Connor's corporate network constituted a catastrophic breach of contract. I spoke clearly and methodically, outlining the brutal legal reality that they could no longer escape. I told Winston that the federal investigation instantly activated the absolute seizure clause hidden deep within the fine print of those loan agreements he had so eagerly signed. Connor stopped his manic laughing. The color drained from his face as he realized I knew exactly how the contracts were structured. He had assumed I was just a silent debt holder who did not understand the aggressive legal mechanisms embedded in the paperwork. He had severely underestimated me one last time. Vanessa stood completely paralyzed, her hands covering her mouth as she watched her husband and her father realize they were both completely ruined. She could not comprehend how the sister she had bullied and sabotaged her entire life was now the ultimate master of their shared destiny. My mother, Vivian, was hyperventilating, her eyes darting frantically between me and my father. She begged Winston to tell her that I was lying. She demanded that he fix it, screaming that they could not lose the company because it was their only source of income. She yelled that without the logistics company, they would lose the mansion, they would lose their cars, and they would be thrown out of the country club forever. Her entire identity was built on the fragile illusion of wealth, and now she was watching it burn to ashes right in front of the very people she desperately wanted to impress. I did not raise my voice, but the sheer authority in my tone commanded absolute silence in the grand ballroom. I slowly reached back into my sleek black designer purse. My fingers brushed against the thick premium paper of the final legal dossier. I pulled out the heavy stack of official court-stamped documents and held them up for my family to see. The bright lights of the crystal chandeliers caught the gold foil seals on the front page. These were not digital spreadsheets or projected numbers. These were the undeniable physical proof of their complete and total destruction. I looked at my father, who was now weeping silently, tears of profound regret and absolute terror streaming down his face. I told him that these were the finalized expedited foreclosure documents executed and signed by a federal judge. I kept my gaze steady as I explained the exact timeline of his ruin. I told him that as of 5:00 p.m. today, his 30-year-old logistics company no longer belonged to him. I announced to the silent, horrified crowd that his business, his trucks, his warehouses, and every single asset he possessed now legally belonged to my Apex investment fund. I watched the last spark of hope completely extinguish in my father's eyes. I told him plainly, and without a single ounce of mercy, that he had officially lost everything. The reality of my words slammed into my family with the force of a freight train. They were completely destitute. The empire Winston had built, the prestige Vivian had craved, the unearned superiority Vanessa had flaunted, all of it was gone forever. They had traded their own daughter for a seat at a table that was now actively rejecting them. Vivian let out a sound that I had never heard a human being make before. It was a raw, guttural shriek of pure, unadulterated agony that tore through the silent ballroom and echoed down the grand marble hallways of the Heritage Club. She threw her hands up into the air, her expensive beaded gown shimmering as her legs gave out completely beneath her. She collapsed heavily, dropping to her knees right there on the hard marble floor in front of the governor and the entire Atlanta elite. She sobbed uncontrollably, her carefully styled hair falling into her face as she wept for the superficial life she had just lost forever. The utter humiliation she had spent her whole life running from had finally caught up to her, and it was wearing the face of the daughter she had thrown away. My mother. Vivian did not just stay on the floor weeping, she began to frantically crawl toward me. Her expensive beaded gown snagged under her knees, tearing the delicate silk as she dragged her body across the cold, polished marble. She reached out with trembling hands and wrapped her fingers tightly around my ankles, her perfectly manicured nails digging into my skin. She looked up at me with mascara running down her face in thick black streaks, completely abandoning the pristine high society image she had spent 30 years carefully cultivating. She opened her mouth and let out a raw, desperate wail, begging me not to take the logistics company. I looked down at her, feeling nothing but a profound emptiness as she clung to my legs like a drowning woman. She sobbed uncontrollably, her chest heaving as she finally confessed the darkest secret she had been hiding from everyone, including her own husband. Her voice was loud and hysterical, echoing off the gilded walls as she screamed that I did not understand what was truly at stake. She admitted right there in front of the entire Atlanta elite that she had secretly taken out a massive second mortgage on our family mansion. She said she had bypassed Winston's accountants and quietly leveraged the only piece of real property they actually owned outright. The words spilled from her mouth in a frantic, panicked rush as she confessed that she had pumped all of that borrowed money directly into Connor's failing investment firm. Vivian wept as she revealed the pathetic truth behind their entire existence. She screamed that she had to funnel those secret funds to Connor, just to keep up the grand illusion that Vanessa was married to a wildly successful tycoon. She said the country club dues, the designer dresses, The leased luxury cars and the lavish charity donations were all paid for by a mountain of patched-up debt that was constantly on the verge of collapsing. She looked up at me with wild, terrified eyes and cried that if my investment fund seized Winston's logistics company, they would have absolutely zero income left to service that massive secret mortgage. She gripped my legs tighter and wailed that the bank would foreclose on the mansion by the end of the month, and they would literally be thrown out onto the street. The grand ballroom descended into a suffocating, absolute silence. The truth was finally laid bare for the entire world to see. The royal, flawless lifestyle my parents had paraded around the city for 3 decades was nothing but a hollow, desperate facade. They were not old money. They were not even new money. They were entirely bankrupt frauds who had mortgaged their own shelter just to buy the temporary approval of people who secretly despised them. The wealthy patrons who had once attended my mother's lavish garden parties now looked down at her with expressions of sheer unadulterated revulsion. The elite circles of Atlanta operated on strict rules of financial authenticity, and discovering that my family was swimming in toxic debt made them immediate social pariahs. The guests physically stepped back, pulling their expensive coats tighter around their shoulders, as if my family's sudden destitution was a contagious disease. Winston slowly pushed himself up from the floor, his face a mask of pure disbelief. He had just lost his 30-year-old company to the daughter he discarded, and now he was discovering that his wife had secretly mortgaged the roof over his head to fund a white son-in-law who had just publicly degraded him. The sheer volume of betrayal short-circuited whatever was left of Winston's rational mind. He stared at Vivian as she groveled at my feet, his chest rising and falling with heavy, ragged breaths. He realized that every single sacrifice he had made to achieve proximity to whiteness had been squandered by his own family. Vanessa stood frozen for a long, agonizing moment as the reality of her mother's confession washed over her. The perfect high society life she thought she had earned was entirely funded by her mother's secret theft. Her billionaire husband was actually a broke criminal, relying on her mother's stolen equity just to keep the lights on. Her entire identity as the golden child, the wealthy, flawless socialite, was instantly evaporated into thin air. The psychological break was immediate and violent. Vanessa let out a piercing, guttural scream that sounded like a wounded animal. All the polite manners and country club etiquette she had spent her life mimicking were instantly stripped away, leaving only raw, violent fury. Vanessa lunged forward, her high heels slipping on the marble as she threw herself directly at our mother. She grabbed Vivian by the shoulders of her beaded gown and violently yanked her away from my legs. Vanessa screamed in her mother's face, calling her a stupid, pathetic old woman for trusting Connor with their only safety net. She shook Vivian violently, demanding to know how she could be so ignorant as to mortgage the family home without telling anyone. Vivian shrieked in terror and tried to push Vanessa away, but Vanessa was blinded by her own destruction. She slapped her mother hard across the face, the sharp cracking sound echoing terribly in the quiet room. Winston saw his golden child attack his wife and completely lost whatever fragile control he had left. He let out a roar of absolute rage and threw himself into the chaotic scuffle. He grabbed Vanessa by the arm, trying to rip her away from Vivian, but Connor suddenly intervened. Connor, who was already ruined and facing federal prison, decided to unleash all his remaining hatred on the people who had brought him into this mess. Connor tackled Winston from the side, driving his shoulder into the older man's ribs and sending them both crashing into a table filled with expensive crystal champagne flutes. The table collapsed under their weight, sending shattered glass and alcohol exploding across the ballroom floor. The scene devolved into absolute pure chaos. The flawless, perfect family that had spent 30 years telling me I was socially unfit was now physically tearing each other apart in the center of the most exclusive club in the state. Winston punched Connor in the jaw, blood spraying across the pristine white tablecloths. Connor grabbed Winston by the collar of his custom tuxedo and slammed his head back against the marble floor, screaming vile, racist insults with every strike. Vanessa and Vivian were rolling on the ground, pulling at each other's hair, and tearing their expensive designer dresses to shreds as they sobbed and screamed accusations of betrayal. They were completely covered in spilled champagne and broken glass rolling around in the dirt of their own monumental failures. I took a slow, deliberate step back from the violent, sprawling mess on the floor. I stood perfectly straight, smoothing down the fabric of my black silk dress. I watched them destroy each other with eyes as cold and hard as glacial ice. I did not call for help. I did not ask the security guards to intervene. I simply watched the inevitable implosion of a family that had built their entire foundation on lies, greed, and the systematic abuse of their youngest daughter. They had sold their souls for the illusion of power, and now they were paying the ultimate price in front of the very audience they had sacrificed me to impress. The elite guests were in an absolute panic. Wealthy dowagers clutched their pearls and hurried toward the exit doors, while prominent businessmen shouted for the club manager to call the authorities. The governor was quickly ushered away by his security detail, his face pale with disgust as he looked back at the horrific brawl unfolding on the floor. The grand birthday gala had transformed into a grotesque gladiator arena of exposed secrets and shattered privilege. My family continued to scream and strike at each other, their voices raw and hoarse. Vivian was crying out that she had only done it for Vanessa, while Vanessa screamed that her mother had ruined her life. Winston was coughing up blood as he tried to pry Connor's hands from his throat, while Connor laughed maniacally, telling them they were all going to end up in the gutter where they belonged. They were so consumed by their mutual hatred and their total financial devastation that they did not even realize the entire room was emptying around them. They did not care that their social standing was dead, they only cared about inflicting as much pain on each other as possible. But then a new sound pierced the heavy, humid air of the ballroom. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the distance, but it grew louder and more piercing with every passing second. The guests who were rushing toward the glass entrance doors suddenly stopped and pointed outside. The flashing reflections of bright red and blue lights began to dance violently against the tall windows of the Heritage Club. The sound multiplied as more and more heavy sirens joined the chorus, wailing loudly as they tore through the quiet Atlanta streets and converged directly on the front entrance of the building. The sheer volume of the sirens was deafening, echoing off the surrounding skyscrapers and vibrating through the thick marble walls of the club. The remaining guests gasped in relief, assuming that the club manager had finally managed to summon the local police to break up the violent, unhinged brawl happening on the ballroom floor. My family suddenly froze in their tracks. Winston stopped throwing punches, and Connor slowly released his grip on my father's throat. Vivian and Vanessa lay panting on the floor covered in glass and torn silk, their eyes wide with sudden terror as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated their bruised and bleeding faces. They all stared toward the front doors, breathing heavily, thinking the authorities had arrived to arrest them for public disturbance and assault. They waited in paralyzed silence as the heavy oak doors of the Heritage Club were violently thrown open. The heavy oak doors of the Heritage Club flew open with a deafening crash that echoed through the silent grand ballroom. Heavily armed federal agents and local police officers poured into the elegant space, moving with swift, aggressive precision. Their dark tactical gear and heavy boots completely shattered the fragile high society illusion of the room. My family stayed frozen on the cold marble floor covered in spilled champagne and shattered crystal, fully expecting the officers to arrest them for the violent, unhinged brawl that had just taken place. My mother Vivian let out a whimpering gasp, trying desperately to cover her torn, beaded gown with her shaking hands. My father Winston raised his arms in a pathetic gesture of surrender, his face heavily bruised and bleeding from where Connor had repeatedly struck him. But the federal agents did not even look at my parents. They marched directly past Winston and Vivian, their eyes locked entirely on Connor. Connor tried to scramble backward, his expensive custom tuxedo, soaked in alcohol and sweat. but his leather shoes slipped uselessly on the wet marble floor. Two massive federal agents grabbed him by the shoulders and violently hauled him to his feet. Connor screamed in protest, demanding that they let him go, claiming that he was a powerful investment banker and a platinum member of the club. His deeply ingrained arrogant privilege was still blinding him to reality, even as the cold steel handcuffs snapped tightly around his wrists with a sharp metallic click. The lead federal agent stepped forward and looked Connor dead in the eye. His voice was deep and completely devoid of any sympathy as he began to loudly read Connor his Miranda rights. He stated clearly for the entire ballroom to hear that Connor was being placed under immediate arrest for massive federal financial fraud, wire fraud, and the illegal use of forged family assets to secure fraudulent commercial loans. The agent explained that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had just raided Connor's corporate headquarters and seized all his servers. The Food and Drug Administration criminal probe had blown the lid off his entire illegal operation, exposing the fact that his luxury real estate portfolio was built on toxic stolen patents and completely fabricated collateral. Connor began to thrash wildly against the agents, his polished white elite facade completely destroyed. He was crying and begging, his voice cracking as he looked desperately around the room for anyone to save him. He yelled that it was a huge mistake that he was a wealthy, respected man who did not belong in a federal holding cell. But the agents simply jerked him forward, dragging him across the beautiful floor toward the exit. The elite patrons of the Heritage Club. The people Connor had spent his entire life trying to impress simply turned their backs on him. They whispered among themselves, their eyes filled with utter disgust as they watched the so-called tycoon being hauled away like a common street criminal. Vanessa sat up on the floor, her hair a tangled mess of sweat and broken glass. She reached her trembling hand out toward the doors, sobbing hysterically as she watched her billionaire husband disappear into the back of a flashing police cruiser. Her entire identity had just been escorted out in handcuffs. She was no longer the perfect high society wife, she was the disgraced spouse of a federal fraudster. She turned her head and looked at my parents, her eyes wide with a terrifying blank emptiness. Vivian and Winston were still kneeling in the dirt and debris of their ruined evening, completely paralyzed by the speed of their total destruction. The horrific reality of their situation finally began to sink into their panicked minds. The logistics company was completely gone. Connor's investment firm was seized by the federal government. The secret second mortgage on the family mansion was exposed for everyone to see. They had absolutely nothing left to their names. Winston's eyes slowly darted from the exit doors back to me. He looked at my calm, unbothered posture and my flawless black silk dress. He remembered the thick legal folder I was holding. He remembered that I was the absolute majority owner of the Apex Fund that now controlled his entire life and everything he had ever built. Winston dragged himself across the floor, his bruised hands slipping on the spilled champagne. He did not even try to stand up like a man. He crawled to me like a beaten dog. His lifelong obsession with respectability politics completely abandoned in the face of his absolute financial ruin. Vivian followed right behind him, her tears leaving streaks of dark makeup across her pale, sunken cheeks. They reached my feet and looked up at me with expressions of pure, pathetic desperation. Winston begged me to help them, his voice a weak, trembling whisper. He said I had the money and the power to fix everything. He pleaded with me to use my billions to pay off the federal prosecutors and bail Connor out of jail so they could somehow salvage the family name. Vivian grabbed the hem of my dress, her hands shaking violently as she wept. She cried out that I had to save them from this living nightmare, to save the family face before the scandal completely destroyed their reputation in the elite circles of Atlanta. She sobbed loudly, begging me to remember that we were blood and that we had to stick together in times of crisis. She wailed my name like a desperate prayer, crying, "Tara, please, he is your sister's family." She actually had the sheer audacity to use Vanessa's toxic marriage as a weapon of guilt against me. She wanted me to save the man who had just publicly degraded them and screamed horrific racist insults in their faces, simply because he was tied to her precious golden child. They wanted me to sacrifice my own empire to rescue the very people who had deliberately tried to steal my life work. I looked down at my parents groveling in the broken glass and spilled wine. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness or pity. I slowly reached down and firmly grabbed the fabric of my dress, coldly pulling it out of my mother's desperate grip. I took a deliberate step backward, putting physical distance between my monumental success and their pathetic, catastrophic failure. I looked at Vivian and Winston with eyes as cold as glacial ice and let the heavy silence stretch out before I finally spoke. I told them that sharing DNA does not give them the right to bleed me dry and trample on me for their own selfish gain. I kept my voice perfectly even, ensuring that every single word landed like a heavy physical blow. I reminded them of the years I spent begging for their love and basic human decency, only to be called a failure and an embarrassment. I reminded them of the night Vanessa maliciously poured industrial bleach into my natural hair care formula, while they completely turned a blind eye to her toxic jealousy. I reminded them of the moment they willingly stole my discarded notebook and forged legal documents to patent pure poison just so they could claim illegal ownership over my hard work and ingenuity. I told them they had never treated me like family. They had treated me like a disposable stepping stone, like an obstacle to be crushed, like a convenient scapegoat for their own miserable shortcomings. They had worshipped a racist fraud simply because he offered them the cheap illusion of high society wealth, while they gladly let their own daughters suffer in silence. I told them I was not a bank for their toxic mistakes. I told them I would not spend a single dime to save Connor from a federal prison cell where he absolutely belonged. I told Winston that his precious logistics company was already being rapidly liquidated by my asset managers, and that his 30-year legacy was officially wiped off the map. I told Vivian that her fake country club friends were already deleting her phone number and pretending they never even knew her. I let them fully digest the brutal fact that there was no magical rescue coming. There was no hidden reserve of family loyalty they could tap into because they had completely and permanently bankrupted that account years ago. Vanessa began to scream again, hitting her bruised fists against the hard floor in a childish tantrum, but I entirely ignored her. My parents wept loudly, their faces buried in their hands, as the absolute finality of my words crushed their last remaining fragments of hope. They truly thought this was the bottom. They thought they could not possibly fall any further into the dark, miserable pit of their own making. They believed that losing their business and their fragile social standing was the absolute worst punishment they could ever endure. But I was not finished. I had one final piece of vital business to conduct before I walked out of the Heritage Club and out of their lives forever. I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my thick leather legal folder one last time. I opened it carefully and extracted a single crisp sheet of heavy white paper. I pulled a sleek silver luxury pen from my clutch and smoothly signed my name at the bottom of the document, right there in front of their tear-soaked, terrified faces. The simple scratching sound of the pen against the paper seemed incredibly loud in the dead silent room. I let the wet ink dry for a split second before I casually dropped the official document onto the shattered glass of a broken cocktail table directly in front of where my mother was kneeling. I looked down at Vivian, who was staring at the paper with wide, uncomprehending eyes. I told her that she was absolutely right to be terrified about that secret second mortgage she had taken out to blindly fund Connor's illegal schemes. I explained that when my Apex investment fund began aggressively acquiring distressed commercial debt across the city of Atlanta, we purchased hundreds of high-risk failing portfolios. I told her that exactly 2 weeks ago, my firm had quietly bought out the very bank holding the massive toxic second mortgage on their precious family mansion. I let a cold, satisfied smile touch my lips as she slowly began to understand exactly what that meant. I pointed down at the signed document resting on the broken glass. I told her plainly and clearly that the paper she was looking at was a formal, expedited eviction notice. I informed them that because they had missed their last 3 massive balloon payments in their desperate attempt to funnel cash to Connor, my bank had already initiated and finalized the absolute foreclosure proceedings. I looked at Winston, Vivian, and Vanessa and delivered the final absolute truth of their newly destroyed existence. I told them that as of this very moment, they no longer had a home to go back to. I told them that they and Vanessa had exactly 48 hours to pack their bags and completely vacate the mansion that my bank had just legally repossessed. Vivian let out a harrowing, blood-curdling scream and threw herself face first onto the floor, sobbing so violently, her entire body shook with the force of her devastation. Winston just stared blankly into space, his mind totally gone, unable to process the reality of being completely destitute and homeless. Vanessa curled into a tight ball, weeping pathetically for her lost kingdom and her ruined fake life. I simply turned my back on the pathetic wreckage of my former family and walked slowly toward the grand exit. My heels clicked sharply and steadily against the marble floor, leaving them completely alone in the cold, empty ballroom to suffer the devastating and permanent consequences of their own toxic greed. As I turned away from the shattered cocktail table and approached the heavy oak doors of the grand entrance, the cold night air began to filter into the stifling, humid heat of the ballroom. Governor Anderson, who had been silently watching the entire catastrophic implosion from the safety of the perimeter, stepped forward and fell into a measured pace right beside me. He did not say a single word about my family or the pathetic, violent display they had just put on for the entire city. He did not offer empty platitudes or fake sympathy because he recognized the undeniable shift in power that had just occurred. He simply offered a polite, deferential nod, acknowledging that I was the one truly in control of the room. We walked together through the grand foyer, the soft ambient lighting, catching the sleek lines of my black silk dress. Just as we reached the massive glass double doors leading out to the street, the heavily armed federal agents shoved past us, violently dragging Connor in handcuffs. His face was pressed against the cold glass of the exit doors, as they forced him outside, the flashing red and blue police lights illuminating his terrified, sweat-soaked features. He was babbling incoherently, crying and begging the officers to let him make one phone call to his lawyers, but his arrogant voice was completely drowned out by the harsh reality of the sirens. The federal agents did not care about his Platinum Club membership or his tailored suit. They forcefully pushed his head down and shoved him into the back of a waiting police cruiser. The heavy metal doors slammed shut with a definitive, echoing thud, cutting off his pathetic whining forever. Connor's entire fraudulent billionaire empire had officially ended in the back of a squad car. Before I stepped out into the crisp Atlanta night, I paused and cast one final glance back over my shoulder into the Heritage Club ballroom. It looked like the aftermath of a war zone. Vanessa was sitting in the very center of the shattered crystal and spilled champagne, completely surrounded by the physical ruins of her own fake life. Her once flawless designer ball gown was torn into ragged strips of silk, hanging off her shoulders like a discarded costume. Her hands were bleeding from the broken glass on the floor, but she did not even seem to notice the physical pain because the psychological agony of losing her status was so overwhelming. She was rocking back and forth, crying massive, ugly tears into her hands, mourning the absolute loss of the stolen wealth that had been her only source of identity. A few feet away from her, my parents Winston and Vivian were clinging to each other on the cold marble floor. Vivian's meticulously styled hair was a tangled rat nest, and Winston's custom tuxedo was covered in dirt and his own blood. They were holding each other in sheer, paralyzing humiliation as the remaining VIP guests slowly filtered past them, heading for the exits. Not a single person stopped to help them up. The wealthy politicians, the elite real estate developers, the high society wives my mother had worshipped for decades. They all walked right past my family, casting long, sideways looks of pure, unadulterated disgust. The elite circles of Atlanta operated on absolute ruthlessness, and my family had just been permanently exiled. They were no longer the powerful, well-connected dynasty they had pretended to be. They were a cautionary tale, a spectacular public failure smeared across the marble floor. I watched them shivering in the wreckage of their own toxic greed, and I realized that I did not feel angry anymore. The burning resentment that had driven me for so long had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a profound, weightless clarity. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and walked out into the cool, refreshing darkness of the city, leaving them behind forever. Several days later, the chaotic violence of that night felt like a distant, fading nightmare. The bright morning sun was pouring through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office, located on the top floor of a sleek glass skyscraper in the very heart of downtown Atlanta. The city stretched out endlessly below me, a vibrant, sprawling canvas of opportunity and growth. The morning rush hour traffic looked like tiny ribbons of light winding through the towering buildings. I stood quietly near the glass, holding a warm ceramic mug of premium coffee between my hands, letting the comforting heat seep into my palms. The serene silence of my private office was a stark, beautiful contrast to the screaming and the fighting that had defined my entire childhood. There were no harsh criticisms echoing off these walls. There were no impossible standards to meet, no golden child to compete against, no constant fear of being discarded for simply existing. There was only absolute peace. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the rich dark roast grounding me in the present moment. I looked past the heavy glass walls of my office, out into the open concept floor plan of my investment firm. The space was alive with bright natural light and the steady hum of genuine focused passion. My team was already hard at work, analyzing global markets, closing massive deals, and building the future of the Apex Fund. I watched them collaborate and felt a deep, swelling sense of pride. My firm was not built on the exclusionary, toxic principles of the Heritage Club or the racist, superficial values my father had desperately tried to emulate. The people sitting at those sleek white desks came from every walk of life, bringing diverse, brilliant perspectives that made our company an unstoppable force in the financial world. There were no glass ceilings here. There was no nepotism, no fake old money pretension, and no backstabbing. We rewarded hard work, innovation, and absolute integrity. I watched my chief operating officer, a brilliant woman who had fought her way up from nothing, mentoring a group of young, enthusiastic financial analysts. They were laughing together, sharing complex ideas, and supporting each other without a single ounce of toxic competition. They were not plotting against one another or stealing credit to impress a biased boss. They were functioning as a true cohesive unit, lifting each other up because they knew that collective success was far more valuable than selfish individual glory. Looking at them, I realized something incredibly profound. For 30 years, I had begged and pleaded for a seat at my parents' table. I had starved myself for their conditional love, contorting my personality and burying my own dreams just to avoid being called a disappointment. I had allowed them to convince me that I was socially unfit and fundamentally flawed simply because I refused to play their cruel, manipulative games. But standing here now, looking out over the massive empire I had built with my own two hands, I knew the absolute truth. I was never the problem. They were. They were small, bitter people who needed to tear me down just to feel tall. And because they had continually refused to give me a seat at their table, I had been forced to go out and build my own skyscraper. I smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that reached all the way to my eyes. The heavy, dark shadow that Winston, Vivian, and Vanessa had cast over my life was completely gone forever. I did not need a toxic family to define my worth anymore. I did not need their validation, their stolen money, or their fake high society approval. The blood that ran through our veins meant absolutely nothing when it was poisoned by greed and betrayal. Family was not about sharing DNA or keeping up appearances for the wealthy neighbors. Family was about mutual respect, unwavering support, and unconditional loyalty. And I had found my true family right here. I had found it in the loyal mentors who had believed in my vision when I was sleeping on a tiny apartment floor, working 20-hour days to build my software. I had found it in the dedicated, brilliant team working passionately outside my office doors right this very second. I had found it in the profound, unshakable trust I had finally developed in myself. The eviction notice I had dropped on that shattered glass table was not just the end of their fake wealthy lifestyle. It was the final, absolute severing of the heavy chains they had wrapped around my neck since the day I was born. They were going to spend the rest of their lives desperately trying to claw their way back into a society that had already forgotten their names. They would live in small, cramped apartments, blaming each other for their monumental downfall, forever trapped in the bitter, toxic cycle they had created. But I was free. I was 35 years old, a self-made billionaire, and the absolute master of my own destiny. The media was already calling me a visionary, the financial world was knocking down my doors for lucrative partnerships, and my future was a wide-open, brilliantly lit horizon. I took one last deep breath of the crisp, clean air circulating through my beautiful office. I set my coffee mug down on my solid marble desk and walked confidently toward the glass doors, ready to join my team and start the day. The past was dead and buried in the ruins of the Heritage Club ballroom. The present was beautiful, and the future was entirely mine to command. True family is not defined by blood, but by mutual respect, loyalty, and unconditional support. Toxic relationships, even with parents or siblings, will only drain your spirit and resources if you allow them to. Her journey proves that walking away from a manipulative, obsessed family is not a failure. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation by setting firm boundaries and trusting your own abilities. You can build your own empire and surround yourself with people who truly value you. Have you ever walked away from toxic relatives to protect your inner peace? Share your story below and subscribe. And